Hello, Bob.
You're good to go.
Okay. Are we connected to everyone now?
I can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. And I would like to, okay, great. Hello, everyone. We're sorry for this slight delay. This is the first time we're attempting a virtual lecture, so please bear with us as we work out the technical glitches here. I would like to welcome you to the annual George Milonas Memorial Lecture. I'm Michael Kosmopoulos. I hold the professorship in Greek Studies at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And I would like to just say a few things about the event and the honoree, and then I will pass the mic to Dr. Deborah Kosmopoulos to introduce the speaker. The annual George Milonas Memorial Lecture is a joint event co-organized by the Greek Professorship at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, the Department of Art History and Archaeology, and the Department of Classics at Washington University in St. Louis, the Classical Club of St. Louis, and the St. Louis Art Museum. This lecture honors the memory of one of the greatest archaeologists in the area of St. Louis, George Milonas. He is the hero of Bronze Age archaeology. He taught at the University of Missouri, at Washington University in St. Louis, pardon me, between 1933 and 1966. And he created a wonderful tradition of studying archaeology in our city, succeeded afterwards by Professor Sarandis Simeonoglou. The annual George Milonas lecture was held until a few years ago under the auspices of the local chapter of the Archaeological Institute of America. Then the local society dropped the lecture, and that's where the University of Missouri, St. Louis, Washington University, and the St. Louis Art Museum came together in order to continue this annual tradition. This lecture today will be given by Professor Jane Dykstra, one of the world's renowned bioarchaeologists, and I will ask Dr. Deborah Kosmopoulos to please introduce the speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today on this fine afternoon. It's my privilege and pleasure to introduce today Professor Jane Dykstra. Professor Dykstra is Regents Professor at Arizona State University. And for those who do not know what a Regents Professor is, the title serves as recognition of the highest academic merit and is awarded to faculty members who have made unique contributions to the quality of the university through distinguished accomplishments in teaching, scholarship, research, creative work. It's a very distinguished title. Professor Dykstra is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and for the bioarchaeologists joining us today, she's credited with forming the discipline bioarchaeology, in case you didn't know that, to study human remains in archaeological contexts. She was also founding director of the Center of Bioarchaeological Research at Arizona State University. And with more than 50 doctoral students, the center has been a success of research standards and productivity. Dykstra's international research encompasses bioarchaeology, paleopathology, forensics, paleodemography. Among her current work, besides coordinating the research at Phaleron, which we'll hear about today, is an investigation of the evolutionary history of ancient tuberculosis, particularly in the Americas, but certainly on a global scale. And that's been recognized as incredibly important, especially in this day of COVID and how these pathogens spread. Important pieces of work that she's done. Recent awards include the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, T. Dale Stewart Award, the Charles Darwin Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Association of Physical Anthropologists. She's been awarded the Lloyd Kotzen Prize of Lifetime Achievement in World Archaeology, the Pomerantz Award. It goes on and on and on. Dykstra is the president of the Center of American Archaeology and has served as past president in the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, the American Anthropological Association, the Paleopathological Association. She is the inaugural chief and editor of the International Journal of Paleopathology. This woman has her finger in many pots. I don't know how she does it. She's authored more than 20 books and 200 articles and chapters in books. And with that, it is my pleasure to present to you Professor Jane Buykstra.
Okay, there we go. Thank you very much, Deb, for the very flattering introduction. It really is a great pleasure to be with you all this afternoon for this important event, that is the celebration of the contributions of Georgi Milinas to the St. Louis community and the globe in terms of his archaeology. And I'm very flattered to be asked to engage in this activity. And I want to thank, of course, the institutions that have supported this, and Michael and Deborah for their support throughout this process. We tried to hold this lecture in person several times, and it just didn't work. So we're doing this remotely. So please, I would much rather be there talking to you in person and getting to know you and so on. That's one of the great thrills of giving lectures such as this. But unfortunately, with COVID, here I am and there you are. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture. And again, I'm flattered with the introduction and the invitation to present it. What I'll do with the lecture is define bioarchaeology briefly. First, we'll talk about the historical context of ancient Greece and then drill down to Archaic Greece. And then we'll turn to the site of Phaleron, its excavation history, the study to date, and we'll meet a few of the people of Phaleron. As I'll emphasize as the lecture develops, this is a work in process, and we have preliminary results that look very exciting. It's taken a long time to actually get to the study phase, as I'll discuss, but I'm very excited about sharing what we know thus far and how we're going to learn more about the people of Phaleron and their unwritten history. Yes, as Deb suggested, I have the dubious distinction of coining a term, bioarchaeology, in 1977. And while I've been less entranced with the term itself, I am very, very much a fan of what it means to me and means throughout the world, I hope, which is that we have bioarchaeology as a problem-oriented field of endeavor that we've begun. When I started working, archaeology and bioanthropology or physical anthropology were in separate academic silos. And I felt that the prime, that issue that is of prime importance is isolating important questions about the past, the present, and so on, and then drawing on methods in order to answer those questions, rather than, in this case, from archaeology or from bioanthropology. In other words, making the question center stage and the context for the skeleton center stage. So some people jump immediately to the bones and argue that this is the study of bones from archaeological sites. It really isn't as we conceive of it. It's the study of people who are represented in their graves and through their bones to us, many of them whose voices are silent and who can only speak in this manner, through our studies, which we hope are responsible and objective. So we study past peoples, we're problem-oriented, we focus on individual and group histories. They're informed by archaeological and in some cases historical context, as in the Phaleron example. And it can be both scientific and humanistic. I'm a little bit eclectic theoretically, and it just depends on the question, really, as to what theoretical orientation makes the most sense to me. And we address a number of topics ranging from ethnicity to political formations to diet and health and the history of infectious disease, as Deb said. And we strive for transdisciplinarity, which is the definition of that being, to me, in this context, the ability to bring knowledge from deep time to the present, knowing about epidemic diseases in the past, help us think about public health today and healthcare delivery, certainly. So in the 21st century, bioarchaeology has developed a lot, popularity, and a lot of folks who are writing about bioarchaeology, a number of topics. And really, I see this diversity as a strength of the field. I think a field that's vital goes through a period of diversity, and not all of us agree on exactly how we approach the past, but that's okay. I think so long as we're responsible to both the context and the bones and the people, we're doing what we should be doing. And bioarchaeology has become popular around the globe. It's used in many languages. It's been translated in Asia and certainly into Greek. And even Webster's New World Dictionary has an entry, and there are jobs, which my students are very pleased to see. So I'm proud of what this represents. In the interest of transparency, I want to recognize, that there was a complimentary use of the term developed unknown to me by Graham Clark in 1972, 5 years before I did. He used the term then in reference to faunal remains. It's been extended to other biological material, but I'd say even in the UK now, it's generally used to reference human remains. Now, I need to be reminded myself about chronology when I approach the archaeological record, particularly in the old world where I haven't worked extensively. So let's just summarize this briefly. If you've heard about Greece and burials in ancient times, you've probably heard of the Mycenaean period, which extends roughly from 1600 to 1100 years before the Christian era. And that is localized certainly in Greece and is well known because of its elaborate grave goods and the elaborate tombs themselves, which are these large beehive-like structures where burials accumulated and were mixed around and were excavated sometimes without real archaeological control over from whence the burials came. So they're a real challenge for bioarchaeology, but bioarchaeologists, but well worth the effort because this is an important baseline, I think, for later periods, which include the geometric period where ceramics were decorated with geometric designs and about which we know relatively little compared to the Mycenaean period. We're working in the Archaic period, which extends, as I'll say in a moment, from the revitalization of the Olympic Games to the period of the Persian invasion. So it occupies that period from a little bit after 800 BCE to 480 BCE. And then, of course, it's followed by the classical period, which is well known and well reported, less so bioarchaeologically, but people are importantly working on that, and that's great. Something that is really a theme for a lot of this period would be violence and warfare. and you have a lot of jockeying for political power as you move through, particularly through the Archaic to the Classical period. So we begin the Archaic period in approximately 766 BCE with the revitalization of the Olympic Games that extends then to a series of political machinations whereby you have over time a jockeying from hereditary power through the upsurge of power in the hands of folks who are economically important, the tyrants who weren't necessarily tyrants as we would use the term today. It was simply a term used for these people who gained power, had a coup, and then maybe over 2 generations held power, and then we move on to other tyrants. So this was a period of jockeying for power, and of course violence is threaded through this. One example of the violence is recorded historically, briefly, but historically, as the coup or the failed coup of Cylon in 632 BCE. And this occurred when a young man who was known to be a premier Olympian athlete decided that he would take over power and went into Athens and attempted to overthrow the government and this didn't work, and so he took refuge in a temple. He managed to escape, but his supporters did not, and they were sacrificed. They died by the sword, so the books say. Now, one of the features at Phaleron, as we'll see, occurs roughly within this time period and has been attributed to the failed Cylon coup. We don't know that yet, and we're looking at ways to test that hypothesis, but there we are, and I'll come back to this. Draco's laws were formulated in the period around 621 to 20 BCE, and these were fairly stringent laws, as the term as it's used today, draconian, would suggest. Now, few of them remain in the historical record, but death was certainly one of the sanctions that Draco's laws mandated. Solon was one of the leaders of power in the Greek establishment during that time period, and he is known for his poetry and the fact that he brought back slaves to Athens who had become indentured either by hereditary, but also by losing wealth and by poverty. So he is known for that.
Excuse me, Jane. We can't see slides. Are there slides at this time, or is this an introduction?
No.
Okay. We see you, and is that Plato and or
no,
Solon? And no.
You don't have the slides. No. I've got a.
Okay, because there's just some some attendants here who are asking if there are slides. So if there are not slides, pardon the interruption.
No, there are slides, and they should be up there.
Ah.
Lots of slides.
Oh, okay.
So I'm not sure what's.
Bob, is there, do you have a quick fix for showing slides while on Zoom?
Jane, there should be a green button that says share screen.
Oh yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, I did
Bottom
that.
of the screen.
Yes, I did that. Yeah, I wish I'd known sooner.
And
We weren't sure if it was just an introduction or
No,
before you started showing them. Okay.
let me quickly run through these if you don't mind.
Sure. No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I had that up, and that's my introductory slide. We will now start. Again, this is the outline of the lecture, as you can see it there. This is
Yeah, we still don't see even the outline of the lecture that you described.
oh, really?
Yeah, we see just you and two men. Was it Solon and who was the other?
Cleisthenes.
Cleisthenes, of course.
Okay, I have shared the screen. You still don't see the slides?
No, we see that your screen now. Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, so, okay, and so this is where I'm talking about problem orientation of the field and the fact that we're not talking about bones from archaeological sites, but we're talking about context. And that we're studying people. It's problem-oriented and focused on individual and group histories. It can be scientific and humanistic. And it strives for transdisciplinarity. Number of different perspectives have developed over time with a lot of very creative work going on among more recent scholars. And the fact that I think there's strength in diversity. Lots of different languages, it's global, and it also is figured in dictionaries and so on. I mentioned that Graham Clark had also coined a term, and we did that one. There are the illustrations of the Mycenaean period, the geometric period, and then the Archaic period and the Classical period, and the fact that the violence is threaded through a lot of this. Okay, I had gotten through to Solon, who was poetically freeing the slaves there. And he mandated 4 ranks of people in a council of 400 based upon economic standing. In other words, the richest were at the top and less so as you move down. Military prowess is threaded through this as well. Cleisthenes modified the system to a council of 500, much the same kind of distribution of wealth through the ranks, through 4 ranks, but again, an attempt to represent the people, at least the citizen male people. Now, during this period as well, you begin to have coinage used. You begin to have terrestrial forces in the form of hoplites, as you see there, that were very effective on land. And Athens came to the sea relatively late. They did certainly colonize, and they certainly did fight effectively with their triremes, but they came to the sea late compared to some of the other island communities. One of the questions that has been posed by historians and archaeologists has to do with the number of burials in Athens dating to roughly this period, because you have a number of burials, a lot of cemeteries at the beginning, as you can see there, of the Archaic period, and then this diminishes markedly. And the question is, does this mean a depopulation of the area, or what's going on? I think not a depopulation. I think the cemeteries are being relocated or being located to peripheries, and it may be that Phaleron is one of those peripheries we have to see. And we should be able to, given some bioarchaeological chemical tricks we have in our pockets. Again, you have an apparent egalitarian pattern for cemeteries early in the period. Then you begin to get these tensions, which doubtless restricted burial within the precincts of Athens itself. So now we have the Phaleron Bioarchaeological Project, located at a site or developed from an archaeological project on the bay about 3 kilometers from Athens. And it was the primary port of Athens until that was shifted to Piraeus about halfway through the Archaic period. Excavations have taken place there previously in the early part of the 20th century. And you see that there were mass burials there that were excavated at that time. Some of these are individuals that were buried on planks and actually attached to planks, apparently, who had been sacrificed, who died from torture and execution, according to the sources. And these mass burials are not unexpected. In fact, we have them from our more recent excavations at Phaleron. Now, the Niarchos Foundation decided to gift the city of Phaleron, or Phalera, with a magnificent library and opera house and gardens. And one reason that area was chosen was that it hadn't been developed. And here's a picture of the lovely structures at night as they are. Now, it hadn't been developed, but they did do archaeological recovery as is mandated by law in Greece ahead of the structures. And they found a cemetery that was unexpected at that time, a very massive cemetery. It was excavated between 2012 and maybe 2016 is better. We have the earlier part of the cemetery under the direction of Stella Chrysolaki, who was and is the Greek ministry's head of the Archaeological Service of West Attica, Piraeus, and the islands. The islands have been removed from that listing more recently, but she was at that time. It seems to date overall from the late geometric, very latest geometric, to the end of the classic period, but most of the burials date to the Archaic period, as I detailed previously. And it's coincident with the formation of Athens as a polis. And there are about 1,500 skeletons. Now, most of the skeletons are not in these mass graves, but if you've seen any of the literature, television, or other reports of Phaleron, it's these so-called executed individuals in the mass graves who have received most of the attention. And they are truly impressive. They are, by Stella Chrysolaki's definition, these are the folks that died violently, and they comprise a burial group. What we want to do is compare their life histories as we read them from the graves and the bones with the others that were buried at the site. So you'll see those comparisons beginning to be developed as I run through some of the preliminary results. We will also be comparing these obvious non-elites to those who were buried with more flourish at cemeteries such as Keramikos and others in the region of Athens. There are a number of different burial forms, including cremation, burials in ceramics. Most of the burials were simply placed into the soil, into the sandy soil. And for Greece, the preservation is pretty good, because Greece is notorious for having variable preservation, shall we say. There are a lot of pot burials, and most of those are infants, newly born or infants, and some are young children. But the pot burials are numerous and significant. They're significant because the pots may be able to be dated, as I'll say in a moment. We have a few horses and horses' heads and so on in the site, and we're hoping to mount an exhibition of those at the American School for Classical Studies. Here are a couple of scenes to give you a sense of the cemetery. These are the pots that were broken, by and large, being excavated and recorded. There are pots with older children and a few adults, but not terribly many. What's good about the ceramics is that they can date individual burials to approximately within a 15-20-year slot, as I understand it, temporal slot. And this is particularly important because the usual archaeological tool, radiocarbon dating, enters let's just say black hole during the period. It's a plateau where we can't differentiate radiocarbon signals for most of the Archaic period. So we're very pleased to have the ceramic evidence that moves from very much earlier ceramics to more recent ones. Now, the Niarchos Foundation paid for the excavation of the site, but that excavation meant taking up most of the burials in blocks or in their original pots. And the Niarchos Foundation has not paid for anything beyond removal from the site. So the American School and the Wiener Lab of the American School for Classical Studies in Athens has accepted these bundles, and the curation or conservation of them has been a great challenge, including finding the money to do that. And that's been something I've been heavily involved with ever since the project was dropped into my office. So this is what the lab looks like, the conservation lab looks like, rows of pots, etc. And here are some of our able conservationists working on the various materials. Now, we are really doing a very detailed job in conserving the remains, because as you see there on the left, you have the thorax, the trunk of an individual, and the clavicles here are not in what we would think of as anatomical order. And some folks have argued that this displacement meant that the individual was being suspended by his or her arms, as they're not in this case, but this would still achieve the same results, being suspended by the upper arms or the lower arms, which would lead the shoulders to be elevated, and that posture was maintained in death and into the grave and into our laboratory. So we're recording these blocks in great detail. We're recording them in great detail because not only for that reason, but also because recording, for example, the ribs in detail can help us with a forensic activity, which is determining where, if it happened, where a sharp object like a knife might have been inserted into the rib cage. In addition, the position of remodeled lesions on the inside of the ribs give us a clue as to what disease might have affected and killed these individuals. Cancers will tend to be localized. TB will tend to cause a more widespread distress and widespread remodeling of the interior aspect of the bones. We will, of course, be doing the basic osteological task of estimating biological sex. In the mass graves thus far, practically all the individuals are biologically male. We are doing the usual osteological task of estimating age at death. And in the adults, we are using not only some traditional methods, but a Bayesian approach that allows us to estimate age in older adults. This isn't so important for some of the mass graves, for example, but in general, we've been led to believe there was an attenuated lifespan in human history. And part of that, I feel, is an artifact of our inability to estimate age at death accurately in older adults. So there are several so-called transition analysis approaches that allow us some precision in older adult years, and I'm excited about applying these. This approach suggests that the different rows in that mass sequence of mass graves that I showed you earlier on had one row with very young individuals, and the others included individuals who probably were older. Certainly the youngest individuals were all about the same age at death, and I need to also work with modes in this as well. Most of these individuals died in young adulthood, but it's interesting to note that not everybody did. There's a lot of size variation to my eye in these mass graves, and I just show you visually one example there of two men that were buried very near each other, and they varied by about 10 centimeters in stature, and there's variation through these groups. Now, of course, stature is inherited, and the question then arises about how closely related these individuals were and what do we have going on here in terms of the stature. Stay tuned, we're working on that. And we'll be working on that through the study of inherited features of the teeth and the bones. You see some little ossicles in the back of an individual's skull there that are inherited features. We definitely will be measuring the teeth, particularly the tooth, the region where the dental enamel joins the tooth. And we are getting ancient DNA from these individuals as well. Not, again, that's been a problem in Greece in terms of preservation, but we are getting DNA, so we're pretty excited about that. We are doing a form of study that is termed paleomobility. That is, we are investigating signatures, chemical signatures that are embedded in your teeth that provide information about the geology of the area in which you grew up. And I just point out here some of the diversity in geological diversity in maps across the Greek world and across Europe that we will be testing as a baseline to try and link histories of individuals. For example, if your incisor teeth will form while you are an infant, early childhood period, then when you're in early adolescence, the enamel will reflect the bedrock of where you were living at that time. So, and then the bone is more recent, but the teeth crystallize much earlier periods of an individual's life. And we've done one preliminary study of some of the individuals from the mass grave. And what you see here is a baseline and then instrumental air in the gray around that. And these are the values for individuals in the various rows, rows 1, row 2, and row 3. One of the individuals in row 3 definitely spent his childhood and adolescence somewhere else. The rest of the folks seem to have grown up in Attica. So here he is at the end of this row, and we hope to be doing more life histories based on chemical signatures of this type. But this is kind of exciting, being able to say folks look like they've come from the same area, or they did not. As part of this, looking at their life histories, we also look for evidence of activity in bone, and this comes in various forms, as I'll illustrate in a moment, but areas of muscle attachment, wear and tear on the end of long bones, or osteoarthritis, and then cross-sectional diameters and the shape of bones provide evidence of stress over time, and in the lower limb of walking, running, etc. That's cute. All right, try that. Okay. So one study we have preliminary results of has been looking at areas of muscle attachment in the hands in an attempt to talk about activity variation at a fairly gross level. But the study has begun with just a very basic separation between the muscles and the development of areas of muscle attachment on the hand bones that should be more well developed in power grips. And here you see those in purple here. This study is being done by a Greek new PhD, Alexandros Karakoustis, who is working with us. He's working at the University of Tübingen, and we're very pleased to have his collaboration. Now, what he's done to set up a baseline is looked at the hands of individuals who are from historic period cemetery collections that are known individuals that have known records and known occupations. And he's finding a distinction based on his observations between those who frequently used precision grips like the locksmith, like the bookbinder, etc. And those then that were more likely to be using a power grip. And what you see here then, and this is the power grip, are where the day laborers, the tinsmith, the woodcutter, etc., play out. So here we have, and we only have preliminary results from about 50 individuals, but thus far it appears that the men who were buried in the mass graves who died violently are more likely to show power grips versus the precision grip more common to individuals in the pit graves and a few others in the main cemetery. And of course, we can think about activities that might have been engaged in for those that were frequently using the power grip, and those where the precision grip might have been more likely to be utilized and thus give records on the human bones. We will be looking at arthritis, the bone-on-bone polish we call eburnation, the lipping and porosity that we see in the bones here, the lipping, the porosity, bone-on-bone polish. We don't have those studies done yet, but stay tuned, they're coming. I am puzzled by one form of arthritis we're seeing quite a bit of, which is a projection on the second vertebra of the neck, here where the second cervical vertebra, articulates with the first cervical vertebra as the head rotates on the body. And we're seeing a lot of lipping in this particular area of ligamentous attachment and arthritis. And so I'm calling on Greek experts in ancient Greece to help me interpret that. We will also be looking at outlines and bone densities, which will give us a clue to activities. Again, stay tuned, that's coming. Now, I mentioned that trauma was a theme, or violence was a theme that we were likely to see throughout the Archaic period. Here you have evidence of sharp force trauma across the top of an individual's skull. The sharp weapon cleaved the skull through to the brain case. It's completely severed this area of both the internal and external table. And the individual survived, which is really remarkable. But this was an individual in the regular part of the cemetery, not among those that were in the mass grave that we call the esplanade, but not in that mass grave. So there's other evidence of sharp force trauma. I will come back to sharp and blunt force trauma in a minute. In fact, I'll talk about blunt force trauma right now. One of the questions we're debating is whether or not these depressions you see in the skulls of individuals in this mass grave, whether this is evidence of perimortem trauma or not. Because it doesn't, well, the question is whether we have really good evidence that allows us to differentiate forensically and bioarchaeologically between perimortem and postmortem trauma in these areas. And it is important here, and we have a forensic anthropologist consulting, and we're trying to generate some further studies that will allow us more precision. But what we expect in blunt force trauma, if you'd taken a club to these guys, we expect radiating fractures, and they're really not there. And the fracture edges in some cases are lighter and brighter in color. When I saw these, they looked a lot like cases and burials where I have seen ground pressure, I'm sure, making the difference, not clubs. So I'm still withholding judgment. I think we need better indicators, and I don't want to jump to a conclusion that is ill-advised at this point. Again, the same kind of issue. Some of the cases look more promising than others, but some of them just really don't. We're doing a cancer study, an ancillary cancer study. You see here some examples of extreme cancers in bone. But the question that has never been solved in paleopathology is the prevalence of cancers in the past. And it's been argued and argued and argued, but our evidence is mostly these isolated cases of extreme cancers. So what we did in a little pilot study, thank you, Rust Foundation, was to do some systematic x-rays so that we could see cancers that were largely hidden in the bone by doing systematic x-rays. Typically, archaeologists look for the cancers that extend beyond the bone surface, but if you're really going to survey, you need to be doing this kind of systematic work. So we've done that. We don't have our results yet, but I think it's important if we're ever going to solve this question, answer the question about cancers in the past, we've got to do the hard, more systematic work. We're looking at children too and their age at death. In relationship to that, we're looking at metabolic diseases. And there's one kind of change that occurs in a lot of the long bones. These are the ends of the long bones of this is the femur, the bone that articulates with the body, and then this is the tibia distal to that. These are the growth areas. This would be the epiphyseal, or the growth plate at the end of the body of the bone, and then the growth center would be, that would form part of the articulation, would be adjacent to that. And what we have here are obviously hypermineralized areas and lipping around here, which looks a lot like the scurvy spurs that are spoken of in the literature. Now, whether these occur due to scurvy per se, or whether there's a disease that these individuals are suffering from that upsets the sequence of events that leads to normal bone growth and calcification, I'm not prepared to say at this point, but this is definitely something is going on. It's something that bears our attention. We expect to see, because of where Fallon is, evidence of a hereditary anemia, thalassemia in the region. We have models from cases that are documented radiologically and medically to compare. And we seem to see, indeed, we seem to see the evidence that extreme porosity in the cranial vault that would lead us to believe that these individuals died with, if not of, thalassemia. So we're working with folks in Athens and in the US to look at this more intensively. But of course, we need to complete our conservation, our inventories to do that. And of course, thalassemia being being selected for in conditions where there is malaria, will help us understand the history of malaria in the area. We're seeing a lot of evidence, surprisingly, in the young males of maxillary sinusitis, basically sinus problems, and you see them there, the porosity within the maxillary sinus. There's a lot of it. I hadn't expected to see it, but it's there. And we're also seeing evidence of pulmonary distress, quite a bit of porosity on the internal aspects of the ribs, which could be any one of a number of things, anything ranging from tuberculosis to other forms of pulmonary distress. And so we can't identify it generally, but these kinds of things suggest that the environment, the air in where these people were living was not necessarily unpolluted. I'd like to close by introducing you to 3 individuals from the site. The first one is a male who died between 26 and 41 years of age. And he shows evidence of an incompletely healed trauma to the midshaft of his right arm, the ulna. And this is typically called a perifracture, suggesting that he may have engaged in interpersonal violence, whether individually or as a group, we cannot say at this point. And he has a heel fracture of a rib as well. This is a male that died in young adulthood. And he has had a finger amputated, which is very clear. And of course, we don't know why at this point, but this is certainly evidence of either a complication that was treated medically or a removal of a finger digit for some reason having to do with men behaving badly. We don't know, but there it is. This is again, an middle to older adult male. And particularly here, this is one case that I was very impressed by, and I was impressed by this individual's ability to cope with the problem in the healing phase of the problem. So if we drill down to the lower back, we see evidence of fusion of vertebrae, which could be any type of a disease process. But it appears that that fusion has been broken in the course of the events that led to fractures of the left os-coxa or pelvic bone and the right side of the sacrum. So it looks like he was suffering from a degenerative disease that included the fusion of some of the soft tissues in the back. These were broken, and he continued to live after that and being active as far as we can tell. There's no evidence of osteoporosity here that I can tell. We'll do x-rays, yes, but this is truly remarkable. And he lived a long and active life in the face of undoubted pain. And then finally, this individual, again, an older male at the time he died, shows evidence of perforating wound in his skull that extended through into the inner part of the cranium and healed. Severe dental wear, to the point of the dental wear encouraging inflammation and infection in the posterior teeth. and then again, a healed fracture of an ulna on the left this time. And so once more, violence, but violence that was faced in the course of the individual's lifetime, but through which he lived. So that's what I have to share with you this afternoon, and I'd like to thank the sponsors, my valued colleagues, my students who always continue to challenge me, and the various funding agencies and the support of my university and other institutions.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. I don't know if you can see me or hear me.
I can hear you and I can see you now.
So, Jane, this was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. It's incredible how much minute and thorough and detailed work it takes to reconstruct the big picture. You have a whole population here, more than 2,500 years before us, and you get snapshot of an X-ray, if I can use the phrase. Of their life, their health, even the degree of happiness that they might experience in their lives. Would you be amenable to perhaps a few questions if our audience has any? So with this, let me open up the question and answer from Meredith. Is there a reason why one of the men was it? Jane, I don't know if you can see or everybody can see this. They're in writing. I can see them. Can everybody see the
Are they in chat or Q&A?
Q&A? So
Okay.
if I can ask our audience to please ask your questions in the Q&A section, not the chat section. Thank you.
Sure. There's a couple of issues here. She asked whether or not why there's a more narrow age span for the younger adults. And this has to do with the nature of our aging methods, because they are tighter in infancy than childhood, and then you have broadening out even in adolescence, and as you move on to adulthood. So all those jokes about that you hear at reunions about people looking younger and older are carried out in the skeleton as well, if you can think of it that way. But we have the other issue is that some have the age indicators more well preserved than others. And so those that are more well preserved will have the more narrow age ranges. So that answers, I hope that answers your question. It has to do with the methods that we use for aging and preservation, basically.
Thank you. Jane, can you read these questions or would you like me to read
Yeah,
them?
I can read them. So why don't I
I'll
just
answer them then. Okay.
go ahead if you don't mind. Madeline asked, you have so many interesting things that require further work. Do you expect all the specific things you mentioned will be complete in 5 years? Of course, there will be new questions. Yes, we've spent most of our time thus far really getting money to do the conservation, because the dealing with those blocks is not easy. And so, and we want to do it right because we feel a commitment to the people of Faleron who have no written histories, who we want to learn about and share their lives in a responsible fashion. So we are now moving on to the interesting part, which is the studying to me. And we have funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities and National Science Foundation and the Rust Foundation thus far, and especially the Malcolm Hewitt Wiener Foundation that's been remarkably supportive. Anyway, in 5 years, yes, we're actually taking stock right now because we need to apply for another permit. I had thought it would be a 7 to 10-year project, and we've really not completed 5 years yet. It was a year in transferring the blocks, and I don't think that's really fair to count against our progress. But we expect to be through the conservation in 2 years if we continue to gain support. And the inventories, I was just ready to go great guns on those this year. And obviously everything stopped in March. So I'm beginning to be able to get, I've had a Canadian student there for a little bit. He's coming back, or he is there. He's in quarantine at the moment. And unless something happens between now and Wednesday, I'll have another US citizen there. And then I've got 2 guys from Coimbra, which is definitely one of the centers of bioarchaeological training in the EU. They are coming hopefully soon. So we're going to be back in gear, but I can't tell you when the inventories are going to be done. We have a detailed database and then some specialty studies that extend from that. And we are working actually with a group in Freiburg to develop the database in a manner that can be used in other projects. So I'm excited about that too, but particularly challenging are the databases for pathology, because there's not a good model out there yet, to my mind. Okay, is that? Yes, there are. And Kathy Keene asked, are there examples of female remains in the Falleron graves, and what can you tell us about them? I'm actively seeking the female remains in the Falleron graves. There are some. We focused first on the graves of the individuals that died violently, which means we've ended up with a lot of males. And then as we've been working through the site, sort of randomly, we've got a lot of males. So I don't know what. I was assuming that in the non-violent deaths, we would have even a preponderance of females, and I may be wrong. But I'm enough of a feminist that I am actively seeking the women. We want to tell their stories too. Why were infants, children buried in jars? Was this typical of the time period? Yes, it is typical of the time period, and there are several sites that show this custom. People talk, it's not known. There's a lot of speculation about what it means. And I think we'll have better answers once we get through the project. It wouldn't help the conversation, I'm afraid, for me to record yet again some of the speculation, but it's a convenient container. What's interesting beyond that I didn't mention is the fact that we have precious few grave accompaniments for the adolescents and adults, or at least the adults. And we have a lot, not only the jars as the burial context, but we also have a lot more grave accompaniments with the children. And that's part of a pattern, but we don't have a large cemetery like this to compare our pattern to, but it's really striking because you just don't get grave ceramics buried with the adults very often. Sometimes, yes, but the children tend to have a lot more grave goods. And then we're asked, is there any evidence to connect the groups of executed males with the failed invasion of Sparta against the tyrants, which Herodotus tells us occurred at Phaleron? I would suspect not, because the 14 of the 15 that we, but good point, and I'll keep that in mind. 14 of the 15 that we have surveyed in all three of those rows were local, did not come from outside Attica. So I suspect not, but that's a good hypothesis based on the history. Any more questions?
I have one live, if I may.
Sure.
Working through the Wiener Lab and seeing this every summer, it is quite impressive to see how many specialists there are working on this material, and how much storage it takes, and how many hands are working on this project. So I don't know if you wanted to describe to the viewers today what kind of specialists you have and how many are involved currently in this project.
Well, thank you. We have, of course, the conservators. And what's really exciting about that is that we're training a cohort of conservators in Greece to deal with organic material, because traditionally the courses in conservation tend to focus on marble and on ceramics and so on. And I'm excited about there being a lot of trained conservators for faunal and faunal remains, including human remains. Then we have a number of osteologists, human osteologists, that I'm bringing in from across Europe. One's in Hong Kong and who needs to travel at the moment as well. But I'm really for good students who play nice with others and have advanced osteological skills. We're supporting them, not paying them, but supporting them in Athens for at least, they need to be there at least 2 months to make it worthwhile, to inventory skeletons and enter them into our database. I have one of my students here at ASU is doing a dissertation on the children, and then Hannah Lytle, who's entering the PhD program at the University of Durham, is going to be working with adult remains. She's been truly marvelous, as has Jessica. Okay, so those are the generalists. Then we have the group, the private group that's been helping us, biomedical group that's been helping us with the radiologists. And Karina Marquez from Coimbra has been, whose dissertation was on the cancers, has been helping us with the diagnoses there. The one problem is that there's sand, that these folks were buried in sand, so we're getting a lot of shadowing. So I'm not sure that this wasn't a good idea, that doesn't have the right site. But in any event, we're getting some information. I have specialists who are going to be looking at a traditional method of trying to interpret behavior by looking at areas of muscle attachment. Primarily, these are almost pathological areas of muscle attachment. In addition to Alexandros, who's looking more at normal extensions of muscle attachment rather than pathological states, because we want to compare the two methods. And we're working with Tübingen to look at that. I want to try rowing next as a method. What we're doing is looking at behavior with this more experimental type, is looking at behavioral models based on our knowledge of functional anatomy, and then developing a model for rowing that would look like X, and then non-rowing, which would not be that, and see if we can isolate that. So that's the next step in that process. I'm having some folks in, I hope, who are specialists in biodistance. And then, of course, we have an excellent relationship with the Max Planck that was in Jena, that's now moved to Leipzig for our ancient DNA work. I don't know if we'll be able to do pathogen DNA. That's still a question, but we're getting human DNA, so I'm really excited about that. And then, of course, you want to do the minimal destruction possible. So samples will go initially, be prepared and go initially to the Max Planck, and then if there are bits left over, those will comprise our, as appropriate, they will comprise our the samples for our studies at ASU in the strontium isotope and then the light isotopes for diet. So we try to maximize data, minimize the amount of destruction. People doing biodistance, looking at the teeth, that's a specialty group. And I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody, but that's sort of what it is at this point. So it's sort of a beehive, and I sort of feel like the conductor on the stand in the symphony. I'd rather be down and, playing the instrument, but I'm doing more of raising money so the instruments can be played and the specialists can come in and help us.
There is one more question in the Q&A section. What are you hoping others take away from this research?
Well, I'm hoping, first of all, that we hear the voices of people that have had no voice in history, the importance of the people upon whose backs, if you will, democracy has been built, democracy as we knew it in ancient Greece, and who they were, how easy or not their lives were, and how much they contributed to the development that has been so formatively important in the Western world. We hope to contribute to some other questions about disease and health, cancers in the past, infectious disease. I'd say the primary aspect is a concern for not just the history of people, not just the written word that can have so many filters, as can, of course, other scientific study, but that the past is multivocal, and we need to be as concerned about the people whose history comes to us in a different way.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions. So Professor Bijkstra, on behalf of all of us, I would like to thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to give us this this presentation about all these exciting finds. We wish you the best of luck with in the continuation of your research. And we do hope that you'll be able to come back and give us an update again in the near future.
That would be fun. I would enjoy that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to all our attendees. Thank you for your patience. Again, this was the first time that we did a virtual lecture. We will iron out all the difficulties for the future. And if you have any suggestions at all, please do let us know. Thank you again, and goodbye to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jane. That was fun.